On a Friday evening in late September 1983, in Bell County, Texas, the crowd inside the county fair livestock ring had begun to settle into a quieter kind of attention. The kind that comes not from excitement but from uncertainty, because the animal standing in the center of the ring did not fit cleanly into anything the judges had been seeing all day. It was not the biggest, it was not the most muscular. It did not carry the exaggerated frame that usually drew early approval, and it did not present itself with the kind of visual dominance that made a decision easy, yet there was something about the way it stood, something in the balance of its structure, the way its weight distributed across its frame, the way its head carried just slightly lower than the others had, that made people look at it longer than they expected to. One of the judges stepped forward slowly, not with the confidence of a man confirming what he already believed, but with the caution of someone trying to understand something that did not immediately explain itself, and as he ran his hand along the animal's back and paused at the shoulder, the movement itself became part of the tension in the ring, because he did not move away quickly, and he did not speak. The other judges watched him, and the crowd watched all of them, and for a moment the entire space held still, in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with attention being pulled in one direction without anyone fully understanding why. Then the judge stepped back, and the animal remained exactly as it had been, steady, unbothered, almost indifferent to the scrutiny around it. And that was when the question came from somewhere along the rail, not loud enough to interrupt the moment, but clear enough that it carried across the ring. "Whose line is that from?" The question did not belong to the judges. It belonged to the people who understood what they were looking at but could not place it, the people who knew that what stood in front of them had not come from the usual decisions, the usual purchases, the usual thinking that produced animals like this. For a brief moment no one answered, and in that pause there was a kind of recognition moving through the crowd, because some of them already suspected the answer, even before it was spoken. Then from the far side of the ring, in a voice that did not try to claim attention and did not need to, the answer came. Earl Tisdale's. The name settled into the space slowly, not with surprise, but with memory, because Earl Tisdale was not a man the community had forgotten, and he was not a man whose ideas had ever been fully accepted, and for a few seconds you could almost see people turning that name over in their minds, placing it next to what they were seeing in front of them and trying to make the two things match, because 5 years earlier that same name had carried a very different weight in this same county, and it had been spoken in a very different tone, in a place where people did not pause to consider what they did not understand, but instead reacted immediately to what they thought they did. 5 years earlier, Earl Tisdale had stood in a different kind of ring, not a show ring like this one, but an auction ring, louder, faster, less patient, where decisions were made in seconds and judged just as quickly, and the animal he had chosen that day had not drawn quiet attention or thoughtful silence. It had drawn laughter. Not cruel laughter, not the kind meant to wound, but the kind that comes easily in a room full of people who believe they all understand something the same way. The kind of laughter that assumes the decision in front of them needs no explanation because it is already obviously wrong. And what none of them knew in that moment, what none of them could have known, was that the decision they were laughing at would not follow a straight path from mistake to vindication. Because there would be a year right in the middle of those 5, when Earl Tisdale himself would stand in his own pasture and look at what he had done and begin to wonder, quietly and seriously, if the crowd had been right all along. That doubt would not happen in the ring. It would not happen in public. It would happen where no one could see it, in the space between what a man believes and what the evidence in front of him begins to suggest. And that is the part of the story that matters most, because the animal standing in this ring in 1983 was not the result of one good decision. It was the result of a mistake that nearly ended everything before it had time to prove anything at all. To understand how it got here, you have to go back to a different day, a louder place, and a decision that sounded wrong the moment it was made, even to the man who made it, though he would not admit that part until much later. On a Thursday afternoon in October 1978, at the Bell County Livestock Auction Barn, the noise began long before the animals reached the ring, because auctions in that part of Texas were never quiet events. They were a mix of commerce and performance, of men talking over one another, boots shifting on worn wooden planks, and the steady, rhythmic voice of an auctioneer who had learned how to move a crowd as much as he moved cattle. The air carried the layered smell of hay, dust, and livestock, and the pens behind the ring were already thinning out as lot after lot moved through, the better animals going early, drawing strong bids, confirming expectations, reinforcing what most of the men in that room already believed they understood about value. Earl Tisdale stood along the rail, not near the front where the most active bidders gathered, but slightly back, where he could see both the ring and the pens beyond it, his attention moving between what was being sold and what had not yet come through, because for him the auction was not about reacting to what everyone else wanted. It was about watching for something they would overlook. He had been there for hours. He had not raised his hand once. A few men noticed that, not because it was unusual for someone to wait, but because Earl had a reputation for opinions that did not always align with the room. And when a man like that waits too long, people begin to wonder if he sees something they do not, or if he has finally run out of ideas. The auction moved forward. Prices rose and fell. Hands went up quickly, decisively, the rhythm of agreement and competition playing out in a way that felt almost automatic. Then the pace shifted. Not abruptly, but enough that the change could be felt. The better lots were gone. What remained were animals that had not drawn strong early interest, the kind that come through later in the day when the crowd has already made most of its decisions and is less willing to take risks. That was when the bull came through. He entered the ring without the kind of presence that demanded attention, and for a moment it seemed as though he might pass through without anyone really looking at him, because compared to what had come before, he did not stand out in the ways that mattered to most of the buyers in that room. He was smaller than expected for his age. His frame did not carry the width through the hindquarters that usually signaled strength. There was a slight unevenness in the way he moved as he circled the ring, not enough to indicate a defect, but enough to make a cautious buyer hesitate. The auctioneer called out the opening price. 400. There was no immediate response. That, more than anything, was what drew attention, because in a room like that, silence at the opening call was unusual. It meant something had already been decided without being said. The auctioneer adjusted. 300. A man near the front shifted his weight, raised his hand halfway, then let it fall again as if reconsidering before the motion could be recognized as a bid. The hesitation lingered in the space longer than the number itself. 200. One hand went up. Briefly. A cattle buyer from out of county, the kind of man who dealt in volume more than in reputation, tested the price, then dropped out almost immediately, as if confirming something rather than committing to it. The auctioneer scanned the room. The rhythm he had maintained all day slowed just slightly, not because he had lost control, but because he understood what was happening. The crowd had already judged the animal, and their judgment was final. For a moment, it seemed as though the bull would be passed, another unsold lot in a day that had already moved past its peak. The auctioneer shifted his stance, preparing to move on, his voice already turning toward the next number. That was when Earl raised his hand. It was not a dramatic motion. It was not meant to interrupt. It was simply there, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. 180, the auctioneer said, almost as confirmation rather than persuasion. There was no counter. Sold. The sound of the gavel was quick, almost incidental, but what followed it was not. The laughter began before Earl even stepped forward. It came from different parts of the room, not coordinated, not forced, but easy, familiar, the kind of reaction that happens when a group of people all arrive at the same conclusion at the same time. It was not cruel, it was not meant to cut deeply, it was the laughter of certainty, because to them the decision required no explanation. Earl Tisdale had just paid for what they had all refused, and in a place where a man's choices were read as clearly as his words, that meant something. Earl walked into the ring without changing his pace. He did not look toward the crowd. He did not acknowledge the laughter. His attention remained on the animal, studying it more closely now that the decision had been made, as if the purchase itself had not ended the evaluation, but only begun it. From along the rail, a voice carried just far enough to be heard without being directed at him. "That one won't hold weight through winter." Another followed, quieter but sharper. "He just bought himself a problem." Earl did not respond. He reached for the lead rope, and for a moment the bull resisted, not violently, but with the kind of stubbornness that had likely worked against it all day. And that small resistance drew another ripple of reaction from the crowd, because it seemed to confirm what they already believed. Earl adjusted his grip, waited half a second longer than most men would have, then moved the animal forward, not forcing it, not pulling against it, but guiding it with a patience that did not match the room he was standing in. The bull followed, and as Earl led it out of the ring, through the gate and into the fading noise of the pens beyond, the laughter did not follow him as loudly as it had begun, because something about the way he handled the animal did not fit entirely with the judgment that had just been made. But the judgment remained, because in that moment, in that room, with everything they knew and everything they believed, Earl Tisdale had made a mistake, and for the first year, it would look exactly like they were right. The first winter passed without much attention from anyone outside Earl's fence line, because in cattle work, the early months rarely tell you anything worth talking about, and the men who had laughed in October had already moved on to other decisions, other purchases, other small judgments that filled the space of daily work. Earl did not move on. He watched the bull through that winter with the same patience he had shown in the ring, not looking for confirmation of anything he had said before, but observing quietly, measuring what could not be rushed, the way the animal held condition through colder weeks, the way it fed, the way it moved when it thought no one was watching. There were things about it that did not match the surface impression from the auction. It held weight better than expected. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have changed anyone's mind overnight, but steadily, without the kind of fluctuation that often revealed weakness over time. Its disposition, which had seemed difficult in the ring, settled into something more controlled, not docile, but predictable. And in cattle, predictability is often more valuable than calm. Earl did not talk about these things. When spring came and the breeding season began, he made his first real decision, and it was not the one most men would have made with a bull like that, because instead of pairing it cautiously with lower-value cows, testing it in a way that limited risk, he chose a group of his better cows, not the best he owned, but close enough that the decision carried weight. That was when Frances said something. She had watched the bull through the winter without commenting, but when she saw which cows Earl had selected, she stood at the fence a little longer than usual and said, without raising her voice, that if he was wrong about this, it would not stay small. Earl nodded once. He understood that. The calves came in the following season, and at first There was nothing that demanded attention, nothing that would have silenced the laughter from the auction if those same men had been there to see it, because young calves rarely reveal their full value immediately, and early impressions can be misleading in both directions. But there were small things, the way they stood, the way they moved alongside their mothers, the consistency across the group, not perfect, not uniform, but closer than expected for a bull that had been dismissed so completely. Earl noticed. He did not say anything yet, because he understood something that the auction ring did not allow for. Time changes how a decision looks, and the first year is never enough to prove anything. The second year did not begin with failure, and that was part of the problem, because nothing in the early months suggested that anything had gone wrong, and nothing in the calves at first glance gave Earl a reason to question the direction he had taken after the first season. If anything, the early signs looked steady enough to allow a man to relax slightly, to assume that what had worked once would continue to work again, and it was in that quiet assumption, not in any obvious mistake, that the real shift began to take shape. Because this time, Earl made a different kind of decision. Instead of holding back, instead of managing risk the way he had in the first year, he leaned into what he believed, pairing the bull with 3 of the strongest cows on the property, animals that had a consistent history of producing above-average calves, animals that most men would have protected rather than experimented with. From the outside, the decision looked like confidence, but confidence, when it stops listening, becomes something else. The calves from that pairing arrived later that season, and at first, there was nothing dramatic about them, nothing that would have caused anyone passing by the pasture to stop and look twice, but Earl did not need dramatic signs to know when something was off. He noticed it in small ways. The way one calf stood slightly narrower than expected, the way another did not carry through the hind quarters the way its mother usually produced, the way the third, though healthy, did not hold the same balance he had seen in the first year's group. Individually, none of these things would have meant much. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns, to a man who had spent nearly 3 decades watching cattle, are never accidental. Earl did not react immediately. He watched. Days turned into weeks, and the differences did not correct themselves, and as the calves grew, what had been subtle became clearer, and what had been uncertain became difficult to ignore. That was when the doubt began. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady. The kind that builds when the evidence in front of a man refuses to match the belief behind it. One evening near the back fence, Earl stood watching those 3 calves move across the pasture, and there was nothing in the moment that would have drawn attention from anyone else. No raised voices, no visible frustration, just a man standing still and looking at something long enough to understand it. And what he understood was not what he had expected. For the first time since the auction, he considered the possibility that the crowd had not been entirely wrong. Not about the bull, but about him. Because the problem was no longer what he had bought. The problem was what he had done with it. Later that evening, Francis saw it in him before he said anything, not in his words, but in the way he carried himself, the way a man moves when he is still working something out internally. She did not press him immediately. She waited until he sat down, until the silence had settled enough to matter, and then she asked a single question. "What changed?" Earl did not answer right away, because he knew. And saying it would mean admitting that the mistake had not come from the auction, but from his own hand. Finally, he said it. "I pushed too far." Francis nodded once, not surprised, not critical, just acknowledging what had already become clear. "You going to fix it?" she asked. Earl looked down for a moment, then back up. "I don't know yet," he said. And that uncertainty, more than anything that had happened so far, was what put the next decision at risk. Because now, For the first time, he was no longer working from belief alone. He was working against doubt. Earl did not make another decision immediately because the hesitation that followed was not confusion in the usual sense, but a deliberate pause that came from recognizing that something in his earlier approach had been incomplete, and for the first time since he brought the bull home, he was no longer working from quiet confidence, but from the need to understand exactly where his reasoning had gone wrong. He continued his routine without announcing any change, moving through the same pastures and tending to the same work, but his attention had shifted in a way that no one outside the fence line could see, because instead of looking for confirmation of what he believed, he was now studying the differences between what he expected and what had actually occurred. The 3 calves from the second year became his focus, not because they were the worst animals on the property, but because they represented something more important than quality, which was the gap between theory and result. And Earl understood that until he could explain that gap, anything he did next would be built on the same incomplete understanding. As the weeks passed, the contrast between the first year and the second year became clearer. Not in one obvious failure, but in the way certain traits failed to align across the animals, because the earlier calves had carried a kind of balance that held together as they developed, while the later group showed inconsistencies that could not be explained away as normal variation. What he began to see, slowly and without forcing it, was that the second pairing had introduced a nutritional imbalance he had not accounted for, because the cows he selected were stronger producers than the first group, and their bodies demanded more in the final stage of gestation than the program he had always relied on could provide. The ration had not changed. That was the problem. It had always been enough. But for this, enough was not sufficient. The bull's genetics were not the issue. They were doing exactly what he had believed they could do. The problem was that he had created conditions that could not support what those genetics required, and what he had taken for confirmation in the first year had become limitation in the second. He sat with that understanding for 3 weeks before he said it out loud. The first person he told was Frances. He sat across from her at the kitchen table one evening after dinner and explained it without trying to soften anything, laying out what he had seen, what he had eliminated, and what he now believed was actually happening beneath the surface of the problem. Frances listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the bull had not been wrong. His management had been. Earl nodded once. That was the difference. She asked what he was going to do about it. He told her he had already begun, that he had reached out to the extension office, reviewed forage data, and spent 2 weeks studying a university paper on gestational nutrition for cattle with higher developmental demand. And while he spoke, Frances realized something he had not said directly. He had already corrected the direction. She asked why he had waited to tell her. Earl thought about that for a moment before answering, because he needed to be sure he was fixing the right thing. Frances accepted that, and that was where the correction truly began. The third year did not announce itself as different, and that was what made the shift more meaningful, because nothing in the early days demanded attention, and nothing presented itself as immediate proof that anything had been solved. Earl did not rush to interpret it. He had already learned what that cost. But within the first week, there was something that could not be ignored, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. And consistency is what separates coincidence from direction. The calves stood differently. They carried themselves with a balance that did not need explanation, and as the days passed, that balance held, not perfectly, not uniformly, but in a way that aligned across the group in a pattern Earl had been trying to reach since the first year. He walked the pasture every morning without writing anything down, allowing the observation to settle fully before assigning it meaning. And when he finally opened the notebook in the barn after 2 weeks, he wrote a single line: "The program is working." He closed the notebook and went inside. Frances was at the table. She looked at him. He said nothing at first. Then he said they needed to talk about the county fair. Frances understood immediately what that meant, not because of the words, but because of the tone behind them. And for the first time since the auction, neither of them spoke about doubt. On a Friday morning in early October 1983, in Bell County, Texas, the livestock ring filled slowly with the kind of attention that builds when people expect to see something worth judging, even if they do not yet know what that something is. Earl arrived early, unloaded his animal without drawing attention to himself, and moved through the process the same way he had moved through every step that led to that moment, without performance, without explanation, simply doing what needed to be done. The bull standing in his pen was not the same animal the crowd had laughed at 5 years earlier, but it carried the result of that decision in a way that did not need to be explained to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The judging began mid-morning. The judge moved carefully through the class, not rushed, not influenced by the reactions around him, and when he came to Earl's entry, something in his movement slowed. Not dramatically, but enough to shift the attention of the ring. He looked longer. He examined more closely. He came back again. The crowd began to notice, the same way they had noticed 5 years earlier, but for a different reason. When the decision was announced, it came without build-up, without hesitation, in the flat certainty of a result that did not require explanation. Grand Champion, Earl Tisdale. The silence that followed lasted just long enough to matter. Then the applause came. Not loud at first, but real. Earl accepted the ribbon without expression, not because it meant nothing, but because the work behind it had already resolved the outcome long before the moment it was recognized. Outside the ring, one of the men who had laughed years earlier approached him and said he had been wrong about the bull. Earl shook his hand and said he had been wrong about some things too, and that was the only explanation he gave. On the drive home, the ribbon resting between them, the road stretching ahead through land that had already begun to fade into the quiet of early fall, Frances waited until the distance had settled enough before she spoke. She told Earl that what he proved that day was not the theory. Earl said it was. Frances disagreed. She said plenty of men have theories, but what mattered was what he did when the results came back wrong, because instead of protecting what he believed, he questioned himself, and that is something most men never do. Earl did not answer immediately. He understood what she meant. She told him that finding what you did wrong is harder than being right, and far rarer, and as she said it, the weight of the past 5 years settled into something quieter than satisfaction. It settled into understanding. Earl's bull went on to sire calves that changed how people in that county thought about breeding decisions, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, in the way conversations shift when results begin to challenge what people believed was settled. At the feed store, the tone changed. Men who had once laughed began asking different questions, not about appearance, about outcomes. Earl did not lead those conversations. He contributed when asked. That was enough. Before he retired, he documented the feeding and breeding adjustments that had corrected the problem and left them with the county office, not as proof, but as something useful. Because to him, usefulness mattered more than recognition. The men who laughed in that auction ring were not entirely wrong. They judged what they could see, and what they saw did not match what they expected. But the story was never about what they saw. It was about what happened when the man who made the decision realized that part of it had been wrong. because the defining moment was not the purchase. It was not the ribbon. It was the 3 weeks at the kitchen table when Earl chose not to protect his belief, but to question it. That is where the story changed. That is where the result was decided. And 5 years later, in a ring in Bell County, Texas, that decision stood quietly in front of everyone who had once laughed and answered them without needing to say a word. If this story stayed with you, there is one thing you can do right now that costs nothing. Hit the subscribe button below. Every day on The Last Acre, we tell the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in quiet places. Stories about decisions that looked wrong until they looked right. About men who questioned themselves when it would have been easier not to. About the kind of work that does not get recognized until years after it is done. These are not loud stories, but they are the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. If you have been looking for that kind of storytelling, you are already in the right place. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and never miss a story. And if this story reminded you of someone who kept working after the doubt arrived, who found what they did wrong instead of protecting what they believed, tell us about them in the comments below. Those stories belong here too.